Seeing that at 6 o'clock, we will start the Teaching, Learning, and Student Support Committee agenda for September 19th. First order of business is call to order. So do we want to do?
Just did.
All right, the next one is attendance. Can we do attendance for committee? We have to have an agenda, we have to form.
You want to do roll call?
Roll call.
We can do roll call. Okay.
That was where the.
Member Stokes?
Present?
Member Allen?
Here.
Member Cormier?
Here.
Member Keynes?
Present.
Member Pappas?
Here.
Member White?
Here.
We have quorum.
All right, next is pledge allegiance. Anybody that can stand?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Next is the approval of the minutes from special services last month.
So moved.
Motioned by Mr. Pappas, seconded by Kelly Allen. Any discussion? All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Next is the approval of the minutes for instruction.
So moved.
Mr. Pappas motioned to move it. Mrs. Allen voted for motion for second. Any questions? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Public comment. Do we have any public comment that wants to talk? You can say no. You're the only one. Just I gotta check. All right, seeing none, I'm going to pause public comment and go to the next agenda item, which is rethinking discipline. Miss,
Thank you. Mr. Chair. So we have Jackie Shirey here tonight. She is our new Director of Positive Youth Development, and she really plays a pivotal role in ensuring that our disciplinary practices not only address behavioral challenges, but also empower our youth to learn, grow, and thrive. Today, Jackie will present our current state in terms of discipline, and more importantly, our desired state. And our vision is really all about creating an environment where our youth are held accountable and, because it's not or, it's and, supported in their personal development, which aligns with our promise to the future, which is our youth. And we do this by cultivating a safe, positive, and inclusive environment where all children, and of course we know all means all, can thrive and flourish. And so without further ado, Ms. Shirey.
Thank you. Good evening. Today we're going to discuss some data as to where discipline is, but more importantly where we're going. Through that, I definitely want to ensure that we are looking at the numbers as just numbers and knowing that our students behind them are getting a very high quality education and we want them in our classrooms. So as we move through what our policy is and some of the initiatives we're going to take, we're going to do so with our kids in mind and what's best for them. Looking at the policy and state law, obviously this is very familiar that we do have the justification to suspend students for a variety of things that fall under kind of those extreme behaviors that affect health, safety, or welfare for up to 10 days. And so we're going to be discussing tonight those situations that fall under that threshold, anything over 10 days or anything within the safe school zone kind of realm, we're not discussing as alternatives or rethinking discipline. We know that when it comes to any of those safe school parameters or categories, that exclusionary practice is completely one size fits all essentially, and we're not going to impose these graduated sanctions or look at alternative pathways to that discipline. So I just want to make that really clear, and I'll probably say it a couple times because I think it's important that we remember when we talk about progressive discipline and alternatives, there are some non-negotiables, and that we're very much holding strong to that. And there's a way to do both to ensure the safety, but also to find areas in which we can address student needs. So part of that means looking at this piece about graduated sanctions. Graduated sanctions can be interventions or things that are done either in lieu of exclusionary discipline or prior to. And so we'll return to that in terms of what our district has done and will be doing in the future to build a more robust graduated sanctions progression. So the current state, some state data, this data is, yes, thank you, sorry, is from the 22-23 school year. So everything you're going to see tonight is state data from that school year. We're waiting on the data from last school, the 23-24 school year. So just keeping in mind, in the 22-23 school year, Our enrollment reported by the state was 3,873 students. That state data is based on students who were here after the cutoff, which is typically in October, for 80% or more of the time. So if you have that exact number in your head, if it seems a little different, that's why. State data is, there's a certain parameter as to when we count pupils for enrollment. So looking at that framework and looking at suspensions, you'll see that our suspension rate is 12.21 for out-of-school suspensions, and that is the highest in the state of New Hampshire for a public school district. You can see that it has tracked upwards over the past few years. It is certainly much more than the state average. When we're looking at the data, I like to also give everyone the chance to read their own data, right? Like there's things that we pull from it. I'm not gonna say this is the piece that you should focus on or this means exactly this, because a lot of that is up to our own reflection and interpretation. There are just a couple things I want to point out that we know directly correlate to behavior, but with a lot of this, I encourage you to just think about it on your own. I definitely don't want to impose my assumptions on why something happens, but for example, the average class size, a lot of the times we hear classroom management, behavior, discipline, it says our classes are overpacked and we don't have enough resources, and there certainly is not a school in America right now that is fully staffed for what their kids need by any means. But you'll see in the data we're actually below the state average when it comes to class size, which is a really great thing, and a strength we hope we can continue to play to, because we do see a correlation between that and discipline. And so if we are fortunate enough to be below the state average for class size, we would hope that we can have our discipline reflect that as well, because that is a tool in our toolbox. So looking at number 2 in the state, we can compare our data with Manchester. They are number 2, and I know that it's a very different district. It's 3 times our size. Their demographic makeup is also different, but I think it's important when we're looking at being in the top 5 in the state to see who's right neck and neck and really put into perspective what those numbers mean when we're held up against a district that does have a more high needs population of diverse learners, a larger economically disadvantaged population, and some other factors that often we see correlations to exclusionary discipline with. So to go back to apples, we looked at a district that's a little bit more similar in size and demographic makeup. So Concord kind of fits the bill when you look at enrollment as well as the population subgroups. You know, it's pretty similar with economic disadvantaged students, the way we educate our students with and without disabilities, that percentage. So this is kind of just a nice, I'd say, baseline of if we are going to say, hey, comparison is important, we want to be looking at something that reflects us a little bit more than a larger city. And so we recognize that, and that's why we pulled the information for Concord. So talking just about exclusionary discipline OSS rates, we are still at 12.21%, go to the next slide, and Concord is at 1.8%. So looking at a district that is similar to ours, it is a vastly different out-of-school suspension rate. And again, numbers are just numbers, so we know that just as we don't know all the great things Concord might be doing, people might not know all the great things that we're doing, and there are much more beyond just this. But it's important to use this data to say, okay, if we know all these great things are happening, why at face value are these the numbers that anyone else might be seeing about us when they compare it to another district? The next slide is in-school suspension rates, which again, we are trending higher than a district of comparable size and makeup. ISS we'll talk about in a minute, how that can be kind of used to keep kids in school, but it is still considered a suspension and it is still reported to the state, so we get a rate for that as well. So that's where we are, and this is where we kind of want to go. Looking at these numbers is not suggesting that anyone wakes up in the morning wanting to suspend a child. We have great leaders in this district. I've been here for a short time, and I can already tell you that I'm so humbled and honored to work amongst a lot of the people that are leading our schools and working with our children. But there is some disconnect that we want to address, because we want to be number 1 in the state, but we don't want to be it for this. And so when we rethink discipline, we need to think about why are we suspending our kids, and is their behavior a manifestation of a need that's unaddressed? And we're not just talking about students who are coming to the table as an identified child or someone who's lacking, but what are they telling us, and is our discipline working? Because it clearly we're still having these high suspensions, so kids are going to be out of school. That comes into addressing their mental health needs. We know there's been a great emphasis on support in that area across the country, especially in Rochester. Moving away from punitive to restorative discipline. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment and just how are we teaching kids to repair versus just punish. Making sure they're in school. They can't learn if they're not in the classroom, no matter what they did, whether they're out because they had the flu or they're out because they received a 10-day suspension, they're not with us. And so it is a shame to pour our heart and soul into great teaching and instruction and not have our kids in the classroom for it. So how can we keep them in school to make sure they're accessing the learning that we are spending so much time leveraging? And then we know there is a correlation from school to prison pipeline. Kids who are suspended, especially a certain amount of times before a certain age, there is tons of data that supports that our schools and our prisons are reflective of the numbers. Prisons use school state test scores to build more prisons. That's how they predict how many prison cells are going to be needed in the future. And so anything we can do to kind of take ownership back of our kids, to lessen the chance that they will be faced with adversity because they didn't have a successful school experience, we certainly want to look at as well. So some of the ways we're going to get there. When I say progressive discipline, again, we are talking about anything besides safe school zone. That is its own category, it is exclusionary for a purpose. We are focused on safety. Progressive discipline is a scaffolded approach. So it's not progressive like we use the word if it's something new and trendy or out of the box. Progressive literally just means sequential. So these graduated sanctions are interventions that we're putting in prior to exclusionary discipline. So we have like steps in between behavior to suspension. Administrators can move students up and down this progressive discipline ladder. So when we build something that's scaffolded, we're making sure that every response to a behavior or an infraction is personalized to that infraction and that student. Because if we do a one-size-fits-all, you do this and you receive that, there's a lot of mitigating factors that aren't considered, and ultimately we're probably not changing the behavior, and we're also probably over penalizing. So those are different ways where we would create a progressive discipline approach. Some current and future initiatives, some of these I'm very excited about because they are happening as we speak in our schools. We are looking at a restorative in-school suspension program. So we know that we're not going to go from highest suspensions in the state to no suspensions. We don't want to go to no suspensions. Suspensions serve a purpose. Sometimes we need kids to be removed from our settings. It's not about not suspending. It's about, can we keep them in our classrooms, even if it's a different location, like an ISS, and when they're in ISS, what are they doing to fix what they did? So how are they accessing their learning in a quality way? What are they doing to repair any harm that was done? How are they giving back to their community? And they're spending that time with us as opposed to at home watching TV, unsupervised, not making anything better. So we really want to build up our ISS programs. A lot of schools have already done a great job looking at ways to use resources to facilitate that. And so we are excited to see how that pays off in terms of recidivism with students who do receive an ISS. It's still a suspension, it still gets referred to the state, it's still taken away from their peers, but it's much more valuable for us to do the work there and start there because they're still with us even if they're suspended. Having more robust re-entries from out-of-school suspension. So we want kids who are out for 1, 3, 5, 10, however many days. When they come back, we need to be able to process what happened and relaunch them. We can't just have them walk back in and go about their day because we haven't addressed the actual problem. Time heals, but that much time away from school without addressing the problem isn't necessarily going to fix the behavior. So our administrators and our leaders have done a really good job at looking and reflecting on the way they receive kids from a suspension and then how they kind of relaunch them in a way that's going to hopefully not end in a repeat. Mediation and restorative conferences, we're really trying to practice conflict resolution and get kids to do the hard work of fixing the problem as opposed to just walking away or separating from it. I'll talk in a minute about the undercover anti-bullying approach, which a lot of people have already heard about from the superintendent, which is fantastic. And then consistent and equitable structures, so we have that vertical alignment. And when we're talking about that, we're really trying to make it so that as our students and families move through our schools, they know what to expect from every single school when it comes to discipline in terms of our approach and our standards. So there should be no room from K to 12 for misinformation or inconsistency within the, realm of every grade is different in age level of kids, but overall our structure is consistent. So we talked a little bit about restorative ISS and restorative practice in general. I like to just call out the fact that we use a lot of buzzwords in education. That happens. I love them, all of them, but there is meaning and purpose behind them. So when we say we're going to be restorative and we're going to do restorative practice, we really are. We're not just going to say it because it sounds good, because that's what we're doing now. We are going to work really hard with our kids and our families and our staff to reframe the conversation around misbehavior and conflict, and to help them take responsibility for what they did, acknowledge how it might have affected someone else, and then do the hard work to repair the harm. It is not a soft approach, it is not a fluffy approach. It's much harder for a kid to sit and have a conversation with the person that they got into an argument or an altercation with, take responsibility for their contribution to the conflict, and then make it right, than it is to be gone for 5 days, not have to work through that, and then come back and go about your business. And we really haven't fixed anything, we've just given time and space for it. So when we're looking at any restorative practice, our goal is to get kids to take responsibility, take perspective, and then make things right. So really, in addition to a consequence and discipline, we're building character. We're building civic character so that these kids, when they leave us and lead our community, already know what it means to contribute positively to a community. Because if we don't teach them that, then we're not going to be able to grow them into who we need as community members. So that's what the whole basis of this approach is when it comes to having a civic character and knowing that we also have to get our kids to buy in that they belong to a community. So that's why we're so proud of our principals in schools that have all these priorities when it comes to like building culture and climate and activities and pride and mascot, all that stuff makes kids feel like they belong. And if the kid doesn't feel connected to their school community, there's nothing to repair. So if they harm something, it's really not going to matter to them. This restorative piece doesn't work. So the first piece is what our schools are doing to build community. And then when that trust and that relationship is broken, we're helping kids take responsibility for it and repair whatever they've done. The Undercover Anti-Bullying Team approach, as you may have heard, is a new intervention in response to a finding of bullying. So when we have students who are saying that they're being treated a certain way and it's making them feel, on a range of 1 to 10, it's a huge problem, it's making them feel like it's an 8. The administrator and the counselor is going to take that student's story and that student's concern and create a team with the person doing the harm or that is, saying the things or causing the upset in addition to some of their peers, and they're going to work together to kind of right the wrong of what that person was doing to the alleged victim. So it's leveraging peer pressure in a good way is the way I've kind of been looking at it, that when we put kids together and charge them with doing something right, it tends to force the bully to step back and be like, well, if everyone else is doing this the right way, I'm going to look really uncool if I continue to do this thing that they're all being tasked with fixing. And so it kind of also empowers our kids to fix their own peer problems and take responsibility for setting the standard amongst themselves. Again, back to that restorative piece, giving people the tools to do the work instead of just telling them to stop doing what was wrong. So we are having little peer conflicts and issues pop up here and there, as you will in September and October of a school year when the honeymoon phase is worn off. But a lot of our schools are working really hard at this and in their stages right now of starting to utilize this approach, which will be really exciting to see what that looks like for Rochester in using this. And I also want to note there has been very hard work done by leadership to make sure any approach when it comes to bullying does align with board policy and state law. There are ways that we have made sure we're still following all the procedures of an investigation, reporting, communication, all that necessary piece, and then the intervention, the response to any finding of bullying. We have this great intervention that has a lot of data that's proven it to work and be very effective. So we're in a position where we're able to do both due diligence and an effective strategy. So this is kind of where we end in terms of our mission. When you bring it all together, we are going back to the basics of discipline is teaching, right? It's not just punitive. And so we are going to focus on reteaching having our kids relearn it, and then repair it. All those three things I have heard different teachers, leaders, and individuals across the district say in one way, shape, or form over my time in the past few weeks being here. And I think it's a really neat thing to organically watch kind of a shared mission come together, because that is, everyone's right. When they're like, well, I want to reteach them, they need to be taught how to behave. And then someone's like, well, I really want them to learn what our expectations are. And then I'm over here saying, we have to repair the harm. When you put them all together, they're the same thing. And so we're going to look at it through that approach, knowing that our first priority is safety, a pro-social, positive climate, that our kids, we want them to be in school. We want our kids to want to be here. We want our parents to be excited that our kids are here. And we want our teachers to feel good about teaching. And I think by doing all these things in unison with Fidelity, we will get there. And I am very excited to be a part of that now. I think we have some great things going, and look forward to where it can take us. Thank you.
Any questions from the board?
Just one, and
Yeah, I'm
it's,
gonna start with you.
I missed Annie's introduction, so I didn't catch your name.
It's okay, I'm Jackie Shirey, I'm the Director of Positive Youth
What's the
Development.
last name?
Shirey?
Shari. Thank you.
Yep, Mr. Travis?
Do you have any estimate of like when you, like, once this is all implemented from top to bottom, like how soon do we expect to see any sort of results?
I think that's a great question, and I will certainly open it up to anyone else. My initial response would be that we're gonna start to see, hopefully, as we move through the seasons of conflict in education, which is typically like October and then again in the spring, that we're building a lot of foundation now, so I would be very interested to see if we're going to see an uptick like we normally would if we do that work now. The biggest data I'm thinking of seeing immediately is gonna be recidivism data. If we're keeping kids in ISS, or we're implementing really good reentries, are we gonna see those kids in a couple of months get suspended again? And my hope is no, because that will show us that that's working. Because oftentimes recidivism is very tightly connected. We suspend a kid once, we're probably gonna suspend them again within the same school year. It's everywhere, it's not just Rochester. So I would be interested in a couple months when we look at the kids who've received exclusionary consequences around this time of the year, how they're doing soon. And then, of course, the state data next year.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Do you have any questions, Mr. Cole? Okay, so I have a couple before we open it up to non-committee members. I gotta write my last question. So, you're saying, so RSA 193.13 talks about like the major crimes.
Mhm.
So you're saying that's taken out of this part, so this has nothing to do with this. And then what happens if a student doesn't wanna like do the approach? What happens if they don't? Like you said that you have to get them to feed it. What happens if they don't? What happens then?
Completely. I think it's like anything else, right? We're giving you this opportunity, this in lieu of whatever the consequence is. If you're not willing to do the work associated with that, then we have consequences for that as well. So it's almost like an opportunity to right the wrong, do it in this way. But if you choose not to participate in the way we need you to and actively do that hard work, that doesn't mean you're off the hook. And so right now we're working with our building leaders to kind of build, like I said, that progressive discipline ladder of here's what we can put in place. What happens when a kid either refuses to do it or is unsuccessful in meeting the expectations for that. Particularly like I spoke of the ISS, we are working on a checklist or an item list of what a student needs to have accomplished during their time in ISS to go back to their regular programming, their regular schedule. If you don't accomplish that, you have more time served, right? So we're gonna help you until you accomplish it, but you're going to make it right, whether that means that you continue to do it, or you have an alternative consequence. But it certainly is not letting anyone off the hook. Right.
And then I guess for you, Allison, so when that progressive discipline ladder is created, are you planning on presenting it back?
Yeah, we will, and in fact, we've just started planning who the team will be, sending out invitation to administrators to be part of the initial conversation. So we're hoping to move as swiftly as we can, but do justice so we can certainly bring it back to the committee once it's complete.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the concern, is we have all these great approaches, but then if somebody doesn't want to feed into it, you can't suspend them forever.
Right.
So I think knowing what that ladder looks like would be important. And then how are we tracking, so you said that you're gonna look at the data to see if somebody's a repeat offender, how do you track that data and when will you be able to present that data to this committee so that we can see the trends?
Yeah, we can, I was just kind of thinking through that too, perhaps quarterly, we can pull that data. I don't know if you have another thought, Susanna.
I was just gonna say, we are presenting in December our culture and climate report of the superintendent, which is gonna go very much more in depth with suspension data, bullying data, chronic absenteeism. We are also implementing a culture and climate survey in October. We have a new program, Panorama Education, to really get a baseline of our students' social emotional competencies. What are they feeling? What do they need to grow in, right, to self-regulate? We're going to put these interventions in place, and then we're going to run that culture and climate survey again in April to find out if they've grown, if they've strengthened their social emotional competencies, if they feel more of a sense of belonging, if they're engaged in their classes, if they feel they have a trusted adult. And so that also will play into the data as far as if these interventions are working.
Kelly, I'll call on you after you. I got a few questions, so I don't want you handing it tired. So you're saying you're gonna present that in December, and I know that something new, you're not gonna have a lot of data at first, but I think it'll be interesting to see the original data and then how that affects even next year and looking at it in comparison. But I think we have been a board that really cares about the discipline, so I wanna make sure that we're tracking it. So maybe after December, we do quarterly?
We can do it the December one is the full board. So that's the report of the superintendent, right, the full board. And then we can do it during the committee meetings quarterly if you'd like.
Yeah, I think December, unless anybody else has any, I think December reporting it to the full board is good, and then we get reports quarterly to see how it's going, and then we can reevaluate it. So then, a couple other questions.
Of course.
So, I don't know if this might be an Allison question, but how do you track what students are doing in ISA currently? Because from what students have said previously is they're just kind of hanging out, they're on their phone, there's no academic structure. How do we ensure that if we're assigning a staff member to do ISS, that they're actually contributing and not just a daycare to where they just get to hang out? Because then they're gonna want ISS.
So can I speak to
Yes.
that?
Sorry, I wasn't sure who to.
Yep, no, and I'm just excited
She's been
because
working really hard on this one.
I actually have a great answer to that because I just checked on it. We have a student in an ISS who, when I went over to see how it was going at the high school, they were not in the room with the social worker because they were busy with the custodian, moving about their day, because that was one of the things on their checklist was community service. So they were actively doing their community service. Prior to that, they had, we're calling them make it right meetings. So depending on what your infraction was, what you did, depending on who it impacted on the campus level, right? So you vandalized something, it impacted the custodian and had to stay and clean it up, or you made a false allegation and people spent an hour looking into something, investigating something that was completely unfounded, right? Those people's time and mental load was affected. So we're having students sit with them, whether it was the SRO, the custodian, a secretary who had to go make all these phone calls, and they're hearing how they were impacted. And then we're having our students then go to the administrators on their last day or their last half of ISS and present basically, this was my impact of what I did, this is who was affected and how, and the administrator will say, yep, that's adequate, or no, we need to talk a little bit more because you're still not getting the picture. So that's kind of where that, I don't like to call it a checklist, but it's a structure, I guess, comes in where they have a certain amount of things that fill up their day. And I will say at the high school, they worked really hard on figuring out how to staff that and support that so that that student is spending meaningful time with the right person and not being babysat all day by someone who should be seeing other kids, right? Or who is not an appropriate person to impose that consequence. So and again, this is all kind of in a pilot phase, but I am so grateful and proud of the high school for really taking this on and kind of piecemealing that together. So it is starting to look meaningful. I'm just really excited because it worked so far this week. I think that we have some kinks to work out. I don't think it's going to work everywhere. I've had some conversations with the elementary schools about what this could look like for them, because staffing, space, all that is very different. But there's going to be a standard to ISS. It is not just going to be babysitting anymore or putting your head down. I'm not going to say they're going to love it, but
Well, I think
They're gonna
that's
be busy.
important. You should love ISS.
Right.
Because if you're in a class and you're struggling and you don't want to do it, cause a problem, get ISS, and then you just get to hang out all day. So, not saying that's what happens to everybody, but it's a really good avoidance in your class.
absolutely.
So my last question is gonna be about special ed. So I don't know if I relate this to Sarah Camus, but special education students are a little different. How are we incorporating special education into this new program, just like restorative justice?
Yeah, so I think the important part too is we're thinking about students that have disabilities. We know they have educational disabilities in those areas. But what we also want to do is really teach students skills to be able to get through those different areas, and so hopefully things don't happen again in the future. So I think it will obviously be a little different when we're thinking about special ed students, but the idea of wanting to have that restorative part of it, plus also having time that they're able to learn those skills is going to be really important, which is going back to their special ed services too.
So just, I mean, it sounds like there's no real firm how special ed is gonna incorporate. Are you still working on that part of it?
No, I mean, it would be like any other ISS where they receive their services, like any services come to them, or they are, the way it would always work.
I mean, the only difference would be if it is sort of a part of a student's disability side of it is where we'd be teaching like more of the skills through special ed, but they would still be incorporated in this practice.
Okay. Yes, Ellen?
Like the difficult students and the habitual offenders, will you? Would you consider like the CHINS petition?
As, like an intervention?
Intervention?
Yes, so when we're talking about like voluntary chins from, especially when we're looking at our attendance and our truancy policy, we built that in quite a bit, we actually had our new truancy officer, attendance counselor, make a connection to really decide when chins is gonna be a referral. And they're wanting us to do those voluntary ones sooner, which is great because they wanna provide services. I think when we're looking at truly discipline that might not have that attendance piece to it, it's a strategy for a family when no other discipline, intervention, or consequence is working. I think there's certainly a case to be made for that as well. I don't know that it's been examined to be like right in there and that we have a clear correlation to when that comes in, but it is a resource we use for other things, so I can see the value. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. I don't know anything about schools or children or anything else, but I'll just tell you this, my experience in the last year and a half, 2 years and a half on here, has been that parents have an awful lot to do with the behavior of the child in the school. So I don't see anything in here that says anything about parents, so how do they incorporate it and get incorporated into the program?
Yes, no, great point. So part of that reentry piece, when we're looking at after kids have been suspended, and we're talking about a more robust reentry, we really want to place a heavier emphasis on those meetings. A lot of the times we'll say, oh, we have to have a reentry meeting, and we'll make a phone call to a parent when the kid comes back, or we'll touch base with them later in the day and say, oh yeah, Johnny came back, he had an incident-free day, everything's fine. We want parents to come in, or if they can't come in, we're going to make that due diligence effort to get them in or talk to them on the phone, and really have a meeting, spend time talking with them having parents and guardians as partners. So we need you to do this because we are doing all these things at school and these are the results we're getting. So how do we help each other? I think that open communication, I also think that strengthening our parent partnerships with the positive communication is gonna help. We always want to try to give them a good phone call before a bad one. So when we give the bad one, it's not the only relationship or moment we've had with the parent. So I think just as a school entity strengthening those relationships, but when it comes to their involvement, I actually had a conversation today with the coordinator for Rochester Mental Health Alliance, and we were talking a lot about parent education and resources for parents, and I have seen in the past where a big piece of this is providing our parents with knowledge and resources about behavior as well, mental health, trauma-informed, right? Like our parents are living experiences with our kids, and sometimes guardians, whether they're parents or not, are also at a loss because a kid is struggling and they're not sure what to do either. So I think that there's a bunch of ways that they should be incorporated. There's also, we want to hold each other accountable. We want our parents to help us, and we also need to help our parents. So I think between education, the communication, and involving them, and having a really clear plan, it keeps everyone on the same page and hopefully more proactive.
And that's somewhere along the line, not after suspension.
Right.
Okay,
The hope would be that prior to
right,
that.
okay, thank you.
Yep, Mr. Cormier.
I got one quick question, and Karen led into it a little bit with a cell phone, where it's a day, to them, it's like a day off. Are they not allowed to bring that into ISS, or can they? Because to me, I think, like you said, the janitor, I think that's a great idea.
Yeah.
But these kids shouldn't have a cell phone if you're in ISS.
And I think that's a really good thing for us to talk to our leaders about making that part of it. I don't know that that has been decided or not been decided, I don't wanna
Sort
speak
of
for
punishment.
how they do, yeah, I don't disagree, I think that's something for them to come to the table and say, again, with the school rules they have in place, like, we're gonna enforce this specific to ISS, I think that's something to take into consideration, yeah. And they might already do that, I just don't wanna answer for any of the schools, but I think it's something for us to definitely be clear about, and I'm sure I can report next time what that right answer is.
So any more questions from the committee? Okay, so I know Mr. Kamiri had a question.
So, you kind of already touched on it as far as the resources that the high school managed to
Yep.
provide and whatnot, and looking at the elementary. I mean, it is very taxing on the resources we have available. So where do we look to, obviously, we're going to, the personnel needed to manage these programs and whatnot, and spaces and whatnot for what is the plan in place for those resources that are going to be needed? And that's, the system won't work if we don't have the proper resources in place,
Yeah.
right? So what's the plan with that right now?
I think because we are looking at some newer things, and a lot of this, I also want to be clear, things like this are already happening. Absolutely. Schools are imposing a lot of things that are attributed to this. When we're looking at making a system out of it, or really a plan or a program, I think right now we're in that phase where schools are kind of doing a needs assessment. Like, we've really tried to ask, okay, if this were to happen, what does it look like on your campus? Not what does it look like for Rochester, but like at your school, who covers it, where is it located, how's it facilitated, the length that, we're asking all those questions, and I'm getting really good feedback from principals who are being able to say, yep, this is feasible, or no, we just can't do this. We can't provide this in a way that's fair and consistent. So what do we do instead? And I think we're at the needs assessment phase of that, but I think that's a really good question when we do get a better grip on what are we looking at? Are we looking at helping a school be creative, or are we saying if we don't find space or personnel, this won't work at all? Once we figure that out, I think then we can.
Right, and if I may, just,
Yep.
at the middle, it's easy to say with one instance, but at the middle school, you may have 5,
Yeah,
6,
absolutely.
7, all
All at the same
concurrent,
time.
all at the same time.
Yeah.
Elementary's hopefully 1 or 2 at most, or whatever, but middle, high school, you're gonna have multiples, and obviously one person can't manage,
Right.
or should not be
Yep.
managing 5 different circumstances and whatnot, so.
Yeah.
All right, it's a great approach, it's just very resource dependent on making it work so that there is a positive outcome to it, because, without the proper resources, I think it's extremely difficult to implement.
I absolutely agree. I think if it's not feasible and it's not practical, it's not worth doing. We're not just gonna do it for the sake of saying we're gonna
Right.
do it. So
No.
if it doesn't work, then I think that's exactly what we have to look at it with. Absolutely.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Anybody else either want to do? I will say, Mr. Perry, when I read this and watched it, I actually told our superintendent that I had some really big concerns, because I think it's a huge undertaking, and her response to me was, well, why don't you listen to it first and then let me know? So she was right, I hate to say it.
I don't
Is that, wait,
disagree
is
with
that
it.
on?
I agree with it, it's just, we've gotta have the people, we struggle with staffing
Yep,
across the
I
board,
agree.
period. And I know when we talked about the changes in the discipline, in the in-school suspensions and everything, it's like you're taking staff
Yep.
for individuals, and again, it's not one case or 2 cases, it's potentially you have 5, 6, 7 cases, if you will,
Absolutely.
concurrently. So.
And I think the hope is, I don't wanna speak for it, because we've just heard it, but I think the hope is with the restorative justice is they're not gonna be repeat offenders. So it's gonna lessen, so hopefully it's gonna help them have a better education, it's gonna help teachers, it's gonna help
Hope.
the whole,
We
right.
hope. And-
So, I mean, I assume if they're coming forward with it, they're gonna be able to supply it, but I agree with you, I think it's definitely a concern. I wanna thank you on behalf of the committee, it's great. Again, any last comments? None? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, do we have any other? So I'm just gonna open up public comment one more time before I close it.
So I did have a comment. It's
Do you
about-
wanna just either stand, no, that's fine, just so that you know, you just wanna stand up, state your name and where you live, and then,
Angela, and I live in Rochester. So my son goes to Rochester Middle School. He is special education. So my concern was with the discipline, what's gonna happen is, how are you going to implement that with children with disabilities? Because every child takes it very different. And how do we help it before it gets worse, or before something happens? Because my son doesn't understand if he kicks someone. He's not kicking someone just to kick them. It could be something to do with his Tourette's. It could be something else. So how are we gonna discipline him for something that might possibly not be his fault, but he also has to take accountable for his actions as well? So how are parents supposed to be able to talk, communicate? Because the big thing is with the parents. A lot of parents aren't getting communication.
so what I would suggest, because we're not really allowed, so I can't have, no, I just wanna make sure, because we value you and we think it's great that you're here. What I would do is, those are really good questions that I think you could email Sarah with, or even your case manager or your team, and just say, hey, I listened to this, I have some questions. I'm assuming, because she's shaking her head yes, that she would be able to answer those questions. Unfortunately, in this kind of avenue, you can make statements, but I think it's great. Those are really good questions that I think should be addressed or asked. So I'm assuming Ms. Kalu could either reach out to you afterwards and like give you her email so that you could email that. But I think those are some great questions. Unfortunately, we're in a committee, we're not allowed to have that dialogue, so I apologize.
No, it's okay.
But yeah, I would say reach out to our special ed director and either ask those questions or ask it to your case manager IEP team.
Because parents do want to be involved. Some parents do, a lot of parents don't. And that's where the miscommunication comes in play with a child misbehaving. Because she was saying teachers are going to do their best for the kids. The parents need to start doing the same thing. It can't be just back and forth, because if it is, it's not going to work. It's like the game telephone. It does not work. So,
Perfect, thank you so much.
thank you.
And with seeing no other public, I will close public comment. The only other thing is motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Mr. Pappas and then Eric Waite, second. I heard first. Any discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
We are closed.